Paul and I okay. Paul and I have known each other for a very long time. He started birding in this area around age 9. He wrote some articles for our newsletter at 9. He started going with John Moyle at age 12. And Paul and I have been birding several places together, and we've probably known each other for 50 years. And, you know, always good to see him and bird with him when he's in the area and we can get together. So without anything more, we'll give it to Paul.
Thanks, Doug. So just a tiny bit of background. Yeah, I grew up in Larchmont and started birding at about age 9 and immediately joined Scarsdale Audubon at the time and started going on their field trips. The first one I was in 1968 that I went on at the ripe old age of 11. And very soon is what? Oh, somebody said.
I'm sorry.
And or very quickly thereafter, the field trips were then organized and led by John Moyle, who many of you know just recently passed away and, you know, living in Eastern Tennessee. But John was my early mentor. And I got to say, again, it is so important for young birders to have a good mentor. And he really got me interested beyond. I was already really interested. I was your typical young kid who just wanted to see life birds and the like, but he really got me interested. And then, of course, years later, I moved on and met many other people outside of Audubon and then moved away, actually, although my folks still lived in the same house in Larchmont for many years after, so I'd come back and visit regularly and would bird, you know, either locally with Doug or with Tom and Gail and Rye a lot and things like that. So I've kept my Westchester roots, although I have lived one coast or the other for the rest of my life, and all my life was spent birding. Other than teaching geography for a while at the University of California, all my work has been bird related, writing books and magazine articles, editor of Birding Magazine for many years, leading tours for one of the big tour companies all around North America. And I just recently retired from doing all that. And now I just bird solely for fun instead of both fun and work. So all those travel I did when I was doing range maps for a lot of the field guides or leading tours took me all over North America. And so I have traveled every state, every corner of every state, and as a result sort of have learned a lot about bird distribution and migrant traps, vagrant traps all around North America. And what makes a wonderful spot for migrant birds is finding a habitat that is good for a certain type of migrant group of birds, you know, land birds or shorebirds or waterfowl. And that habitat is very restricted in size, and it's surrounded by areas that are inhospitable for those migrant types. So just think of a, you know, island surrounded by the ocean if you're a land bird, or a patch of trees surrounded by miles of concrete, you know, if you're flying over New York City and you're a warbler. So these are the sorts of things we'll be talking about today. Now, just be aware, a lot of my travels where I took all these photos was from the 80s and 90s. So this is film. This isn't digital. So you'll see a quality change backwards from all the digital, but don't worry, they're still fine. But we'll start. And I'd like to point out that some habitats are just tiny little islands that are attractive to certain birds. And one great example is a boat on the ocean. And a lot of birds that migrate at night. And if they get disoriented or blown out by winds, or there's a cloud cover and they can't see the stars, a lot of birds end up out over the ocean in the morning and, like a warbler, and they have to beat their way back in. That's why, those big waves of migrants at Cape May, New Jersey, we were talking about a few minutes ago. These are birds probably coming in off the ocean and then hit Cape May Point. Examples in New York, of course, would be the South Shore of Long Island and some of the really nice migrant traps there. But the ultimate migrant trap out in the ocean is a boat. And we were on a pelagic trip off California, and here this poor Townsend's warbler, was stuck out over the water, exhausted after flying all night, and some in the morning it got so tired it just landed on the boat. If it hadn't been for us, unfortunately, it probably would have died. And here you can see at the top this Wilson's warbler sitting on the guy's head on a pelagic trip off California. Some of these birds are so exhausted they don't even care, about people anymore. And that's the ultimate, habitat island. But sometimes also, by the way, birds that are not land birds, but need some R&R land on a boat. And we were on a fishing boat off California once, and this red-footed booby landed on the boat, miles offshore, probably just looking for a place to hang out for a while. Just a word about the ocean, though. The ocean is not this uniform, everything looks the same. It's all just a bunch of water. And that's actually not the case. The ocean is incredibly varied over its distance due to water temperature changes, especially changes in depth. You have submarine canyons, seamounts, and the like. Some birds like really deep water, like these Cook's petrels, which are rare visitors off the West Coast, while some birds only like really warm water and only occur in the late summer, let's say. These are Crevaries merlets, a Mexican bird that comes up off California when there's warm water. So just a word about the ocean. It's not a uniform environment at all. It changes, again, salinity will change, currents change, the depth, and that really causes really big changes in bird distribution. But anyway, what we're going to do, can you see my cursor on the screen? Yeah, okay. So we're going to do we're first going to look at islands. Then we're going to look at habitat islands. Then we're going to look at peninsulas. Then we're going to look at all sorts of other stuff. And we're going to start up here off Western Alaska, come down the West Coast, jump over to the Gulf of Mexico, come up the East Coast. Then we'll come back west and look at habitat islands here in the arid West and in the Great Plains and over on the East Coast. By the way, a lot of my photos are not from here on the East Coast where you are, a few are, but I thought I would do more places you're not familiar with and places you are. So unfortunately, I don't even have a picture of Central Park, which is a great habitat island, or Prospect Park, and I feel embarrassed that I don't, but I figured you all know what Central Park looks like, so I picked other places. One thing you will learn in this talk that you probably never knew before is there is a massive fault line that runs right through the US, right here. No, I'm kidding, but you learn something every day. So let's look at islands, real islands, and why, again, would they be a really good concentration for migrant birds. And by the way, my title includes the word vagrant birds. And some of you may not know, okay, what's a vagrant? A vagrant is simply a migrant that is many hundreds or thousands of miles outside its normal range. In other words, it's lost. And that's what a lot of birders love going to see and looking for these vagrant species. But a vagrant is a type of migrant. It's just a migrant that's way outside its normal range. So we're going to start with way up off Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. And one of the really famous migrant traps is the westernmost Aleutian island called Attu Island, which you used to be able to get to only by chartered flights. Now you can't get there at all anymore. And the big attraction was big storms coming off Asia would go by the Aleutians, sweeping birds from Asia that were caught out over the water, migrating north off the Asian coast eastward, and they deposited them on Attu or the other islands nearby. So birders would go there. They'd spend thousands of dollars to go there in the spring so they could stay in this gorgeous building here, which is a rundown remnant of an old Loran station. And they'd sleep in there and go out on pedal around on bikes. And birds that you would normally see there at Attu would be rock sandpiper and rock ptarmigan of a really different subspecies, a much blacker color than typical rock ptarmigan. But why birders went there would be to see these Asian species that got way out of range, blown there often by storms. This one was annual there in small numbers, wood sandpiper, which actually has occurred in Rye once. Or eye-browed thrush, even rarer, kind of looks like a robin, but it's like the Asian counterpart part of our robin. Or rarer still, a common cuckoo, blown east. Or rarer still, a bird called a red-flanked bluetail. But these are all examples of Asian birds the first year I went there in spring. And it's why people spend thousands of dollars to pedal bikes around in the cold, windy rain to look for these oddball birds deposited on an island where otherwise they would have drowned in the ocean near there, 1,000 miles off course. Another famous island or village where I have spent a particularly large amount of time this is an Eskimo village at the northwest tip of St. Lawrence Island in the northern Bering Sea, west of Nome. This is the village of Gamble, Alaska. And I've spent 20 years there, a month or more, between the 90s and just a few years ago in spring or fall. And it is as native as you can get. This was what it looked like one year in late May, a really snowy, cold year. And birds, again, out over the Bering Sea. It's the first land they can find. There are no trees. It's all just tundra. And this is as good as it gets on the habitat there in early spring when it's still snow covered. This is a boneyard where they deposited lots of marine mammal carcasses over the last centuries. It's like a midden site, and it's richer soil. It's full of dead bugs. Later in the season, it grows up and turns green, but the only food the birds can find surrounded by snow is this boneyard. And that's where you'd go, and you would find maybe an ivory gull eating some blubber. That's actually a regular bird there. But really, again, a rare Asian bird blown 1,000 miles off course by some storm. Here, perched on an old whalebone, is a bird called a bullfinch, a really rare bird for North America. So it's the idea of why you go there, and the worse weather, the better, for depositing these birds there. I go in the fall, it's much milder and greener. And we'd see really cool Asian shorebirds there. This is called gray-tailed tattler. Or this bird called oriental cuckoo. Notice it's green. This is in late August. It's not always covered in snow. Or one of the first falls I went there, I found this bird, a first record for North America of a bird called a yellow-browed warbler. Now there's 20 records now, 20 years later. Another island off Alaska is St. Paul Island, the Pribilofs. Some of you may or may not have been there. It's a popular destination. It's a little farther south, but there's no trees. It's just this grass. And then what you do is you find little patches of stunted vegetation or just buildings around. This is the town of St. Paul. And birds, you would go there to see red-faced cormorant, one of the only places you can see that. Or this bird, red-legged kittiwake. Here's a black-legged kittiwake. If you've ever seen kittiwakes in the Atlantic, they're pretty common offshore in winter. But there's a really rare species related called the red-legged kittiwake. Here's an adult, here's a youngster. And this is a really famous place to see them. But also, again, it's great for rarities from Asia, blown out over the Bering Sea. This is a bird called a little stint, a young bird, a young little stint in the fall. Coming south, way south, because there are not that many islands that you can visit farther south until you get to off San Francisco. And probably the most famous islands off the US West Coast, away from Alaska, are the Farallon Islands off San Francisco. They're about 25, 30 miles off the Golden Gate Bridge. They're very small. Same idea. Birds get lost, they get or blown out to sea, and otherwise they might drown if they're a land bird after just flying and flying and flying. And here's their life raft, so to speak, these one little set of volcanic islands. And there used to be a whopping 3 trees on the Farallons.
No, there wasn't. It was bad lighting for
These
sure. But
cypress trees.
I still don't think they were going to be that bad. They were.
These 2 cypress trees, which have since blown down, and the other tree on the Farallons was this poor stunted Monterey pine. It's very windy there. Nothing can grow very tall. And so you go there, and I was doing bird banding there on a visit. This is many years ago. And because it's windy and there are no trees, you can't set up mist nets because the wind would blow them down if you're doing bird banding. And the birds would see the nets because there's no vegetation behind them. So what you do is you have this big long cage. It's called a heligoland trap. It's what they use in Scandinavia and similar areas for banding birds. And you just herd the bird, which lands here. It's the only little prostate tree. And then you all the way, they move back, all the way in the back of the cage. There's a box, and they end up in the box, and you stick your hand in, you grab the bird out, and you band it. But the Farallons, because there's no place to hide, is birds that are normally very secretive where there's vegetation are much easier to see. And so birds like Connecticut warbler, which is, if you know from living in Westchester, how many of you, have spent hours and hours and hours in the fall trying to find a migrant Connecticut warbler? But in the Farallons, where it's a very rare vagrant from the east, there's no place to hide, and there's actually quite a few records. Another example, mourning warbler. There are quite a few records of mourning warbler on the Farallons, a bird that should be only in the eastern 2/3 of North America. Or great-cheeked thrush, a bird that's actually pretty hard to get a good look at in the east and all the vegetation. There's actually a fair number of records of great-cheeked thrushes. The one time I was there in spring banding, we had a bunch of eastern birds lost out over the ocean. Their last life raft were these one little group of islands. This is a female blackpoll warbler, and notably I banded it. Unfortunately, a lot of these birds are oriented in the wrong direction. They're oriented westward, and probably even though they were saved here by landing on the Farallon, spent a few days hopping around eating flies, built up their fat reserves. But in the case of this bird, the next time it migrates, unfortunately, it may have gone farther west and then had nothing to land on, and that was the end of it. Unfortunately, that is part of what happens out there in cruel nature. Other birds on the Farallons, really cool things again that can't hide. There are no trees. This is a Smith's longspur, a really good vagrant out in California. Or this bird from the south. This is a yellow-green vireo. Kind of looks like your red-eyed vireo, but a little more washed out in the face and all this yellow on the side and greener, a limier green. So a visitor that came up from Mexico out of range. Some really cool things have happened on the Farallons and places like these migrant traps. I don't know if any of you have figured out the significance of this photo yet, but it's Nashville, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So some really cool combinations of birds can appear. Another great combination of birds one day on the Farallons was this. This is all 4 members of the genus Zonotrichia sparrows: Harris sparrow, white-throated sparrow, golden-crowned sparrow, and white-crowned sparrow. So a fistful of Zonotrichia sparrows. I challenge any place else probably on planet Earth to be able to do that, other than the Farallons, just about. Okay, we're leaving the Pacific on islands. We are now in the Gulf of Mexico. How many of you, show of hands, can recognize this place? This is Fort Jefferson on the Dry Tortugas in Florida, west of Key West. Again, an isolated island, 70 miles west of Key West, on the entrance here to the southeast Gulf of Mexico. And so the thousands and millions of birds coming up from the Yucatan Peninsula in Cuba into the United States in spring, get caught out over the ocean if they hit bad weather and have to land prematurely. And thank goodness this island is here with this old Civil War era fort with these trees in the courtyard. And if you hit it on a good day, which of course is a bad day for the birds, they're knocked down in migration, but a good day for birders, it's just can be incredible. We were walking around seeing gobs of regular migrants. Here's an Antillean nighthawk, a rare but regular visitor to that part of Florida. Just quickly coming up the East Coast now, past New York, past New England. I wish I had a photo of Block Island or Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, because they are great migrant and vagrant traps, but I'd never been to Nantucket, and I forgot to take a picture of Martha's Vineyard or Block Island when I've been there. But now we're off the coast of Canada, off the Gaspé Peninsula. This is Bonaventure Island in Quebec. I've only ever been there once. It was to see the puffins and the gannets breeding there. But we went out in August, and right around these buildings where we got off the boat was a Baltimore oriole, which is a vagrant off eastern Quebec. And again, it was the last place to land before you ended up out over the Atlantic Ocean. So a nice little migrant trap. Habitat islands are the idea I talked about earlier, by a habitat type surrounded by inhospitable habitat. And so it concentrates large numbers of migrants and vagrants of whatever group it is that like that habitat type. So one example is urban parks in big cities. And again, sorry, I don't have a picture of Central Park or Prospect Park. The Chicago waterfront has wonderful parks surrounded by city or Lake Michigan. This picture is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, which is a famous urban park of early ornithological fame. But there are many cities that have these great parks that are just fantastic. I'm sure many of you have gone to Central Park or Forest Park or Prospect Park yourselves, just concentrating migrants surrounded by asphalt. But in the arid West, where you have desert or semi-desert, this photo was Eastern Washington State, where it's arid, short sagebrush. If a bird that likes trees is caught over here, it's not going to die. I mean, it could land in the sagebrush and find some bugs, but it would rather be in a tree. So here I am driving. This is the dry wheat country of Northeast Oregon, and it's just dry dirt fields, but there's a ranch house with some planted poplar and cottonwood trees. And heck, if I was a warbler, a tanager, grosbeak, or oriole migrating over here and found this first thing in the morning, I'd zoom right there. And so sure enough, if you can talk your way into visiting such a spot, private property, don't get shot while you try. It could be a great spot in migration for concentrating land bird migrants. There are public parks, though, that fit the bill as well. This is the Snake River in southern Idaho, and here's some state park right along the Snake River in a small dam complex. Beautiful trees, a nice irrigated lawn. You can imagine this could be a wonderful spot for a whole lot of migrants in migration. Another example, famous place, Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Southeast Oregon, isolated trees surrounded by desert. And I was there once in late spring, and we found this bird quietly sitting in a tree. And you might say, oh, a screech owl, but actually not. Look at that rufous color in the face and here. So this is a flammulated owl, which is actually a migratory species of western owl. Probably the best single migrant spot in the state of Oregon is here. You're looking at the whole thing, this patch of trees and this patch of trees. It's in the extreme southeast corner of Oregon. It's the little hamlet of Fields, Oregon, which has like 3 houses, a little restaurant, and these 2 patches of trees surrounded by sagebrush desert. And it has turned up more first records for Oregon of eastern vagrants than literally any place else in the state. Dropping farther south in California, these mountains back here, that's the Sierra Nevada, or on the east side of the Sierra, if you've ever been to Bishop, California. And just east of Bishop, is this little square of trees. This is a 2-year college called Deep Springs College. And Deep Springs is this wonderful oasis of trees surrounded by sagebrush. And California birders would go there en masse in late spring and then again a little bit in fall to catch the spring migration of birds concentrated in those trees. A nearby place to Deep Springs was a private ranch with this big line of cottonwood trees. And this, you can tell by the cars, this is about 1980, but just birders lined up here Memorial Day weekend in late May. It was real popular because it was the tail end of spring migration for regular Western birds, but it was also the peak for Eastern vagrants. You'd see all sorts of Eastern species of warblers and the like that would end up too far west, and California birders would go goo goo gaga of all these Eastern birds that didn't belong there. So we'd go out and we'd see a black-throated blue warbler and the like. And then right nearby, just across the state line in Nevada, was a private ranch we went to in the little hamlet of Dyer, Nevada, in these trees, surrounded again by just sagebrush. And those trees turned up all sorts of fantastic records for Nevada, mostly of Eastern strays. And this is what it looks like under that line of trees. Beautiful cottonwood trees. This is in the fall, starting to change. And here we are, same trip, 1980. You can tell by our hairstyle. That's me right here when I used to have hair, about 1980. We're all pointing. What are we all going excited about in Nevada? Ooh, a male hooded warbler. Well, again, this is 2,000 miles outside its range, you know, to be in Nevada and you're a hooded warbler. So really fun. Farther south in Nevada, really dry desert. This is right outside Las Vegas. And the desert here this is salt bush and creosote bush. That's all it is. And I took this picture looking this direction, then I rotated my body 180 degrees and took that photo. It says isolated springs that bring water to the surface, these gorgeous cottonwood trees. It's called Corn Creek Oasis outside Las Vegas, about 15 miles. And again, just fantastic for concentrating migrant land birds and Eastern vagrants for Nevada birders and visitors like me. Went there once, had a beautiful yellow-throated warbler, way out of range. The driest place in the US, even just a little farther away from Vegas, is Death Valley back inside California. 1.7 inches of rain a year on average. And this is the vegetation. A lot of it's just dirt and rock and some horrible little creosote and saltbush. And again, incredible, you know, if you're a land bird, where do you go if you're stuck here at dawn in migration? Well, what do they have in the bottom of Death Valley but an irrigated golf course? Of course. What else would you have in the bottom of Death Valley? This is Furnace Creek Ranch, where their springs again come up to the surface, so there's water available. And they built a golf course with planted tamarisk trees. So birders go there, big green spot surrounded by the driest place in North America. Date palms. So what an oasis. We go there on the fairways themselves. We find this bird, a chestnut-collared longspur, which is quite rare, or even rarer still, a Smith's longspur, very rare in California. And we were walking around once in the date palm grove, and walking around under the palms was a purple gallinule. Why not? You know, it beats being out in the in the desert, and there is water. So you just never know what you're going to find in these places. Also in Death Valley, a nearby place called Stovepipe Wells. This is the Stovepipe Wells sewage pond. So if you're a water bird stuck over Death Valley in migration and you're exhausted and you want to land in water, your only choice might be the local sewage pond. And one time we were there in October, and there were a flock of cinnamon teal. That's a cinnamon teal in the back and blue-winged teal, but mixed in with the cinnamon and blue-winged teal with this was this Asian tuck that looks a lot the same. It's called a gargany. So again, I mean, here we are, a sewage pond in Death Valley. Other famous desert oases, just so you can see a couple. This is Rattlesnake Springs in southeast New Mexico. Great place for migrants and rarities. Not far from El Paso, Texas. I went there once. We had a Philadelphia vireo, which is really, really rare for New Mexico. And Rio Grande Village, which is in Big Bend National Park, which is a desert park, but here you are along the river in a beautiful patch of green in Big Bend and Rio Grande Village. And it's where the first tufted flycatcher, a Mexican species, was ever found in the United States. They've since turned up a number of times in Southeast Arizona as well. Southeast Arizona, speaking of which, has its own desert oases, usually along streams. This is Patagonia Creek, Sonoyta Creek in Southeast Arizona, surrounded by more desert environment. What types of birds would you go see there? A lot of Western migrants, and then again, rarities, either Eastern strays or Mexican strays, such as this, which is a rufous-back robin, which turn up there every once in a while. Questions? Oh yeah, speaking of questions, save them till the end. I will entertain any and all questions at the end. Same idea, not the desert, but now we're in the semi-arid high plains, the Western Great Plains. This photo is Eastern Colorado, Western Kansas. You're just dry wheat country, short grass prairie. There's a ranch house with an isolated little patch of trees. Place to go. A bird that would be normal in that area would be a prairie merlin. This is the pale Richardson-eye subspecies of merlin. But this is what it would look like up close. An isolated patch. This is an abandoned ranch yard in extreme West Kansas, and it would be a great place for a whole bunch of migrants. Now, a really good example of habitat islands can be found along the immediate coast. Here we are on the upper coast of Texas on the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf is right out here. You can sort of just make out the open ocean here of the Gulf of Mexico. Millions and millions of birds are streaming north over the Gulf, trans-Gulf migrants coming up from the Yucatan and elsewhere in Mexico into Texas, Louisiana, Alabama. They cross nonstop the whole Gulf. If the weather's good, they can make the flight pretty easily. But if during the middle of the flight, they all of a sudden encounter thunderstorms or a cold front that's gotten out into the Gulf and the wind shifts, instead of being a tailwind, it's a headwind, and they may not make it. It may be massive mortality of migrants out over the Gulf of Mexico. And if they do finally make it, beating their way into shore, they're exhausted. Now there's just salt marsh here on the coast of Texas. So where do I land? Where can I find some nice habitat? Well, in this marsh, there's some areas that are lifted up by 100 feet or two by underground salt deposits called salt domes, which means the ground is drier and not salt inundated, and beautiful trees can grow. And that is what forms these great migrant traps on the upper Gulf Coast, East Texas, Louisiana, Alabama. And this is High Island, Texas. If any of you have been there or heard of it, beautiful oak trees and understory. And here's the entry. This is what used to be called Audubon Woods, and they changed the name. This is in the 80s. I took this photo, but beautiful, but you'd think this goes on for miles and miles. It's only for like a square mile or so. And then it's just nothing but salt marsh or the open Gulf of Mexico. So it's just fantastic for, uncommon migrants like black-billed cuckoo, lots of typical southeastern species like prothonotary warbler, and the like. There are also water areas that are attractive to water birds that are surrounded by inhospitable habitat. So if you have a lake in the desert Southwest, you can imagine that water birds are going to gravitate to there, like my sewage pond example in Death Valley. This is the Salton Sea in Southeast California, surrounded by very hot, very dry desert. And this isolated, large inland body of water turns up all sorts of crazy birds, like blue-footed booby every once in a while. And once it even had a Ross's gull, a bird from the high Arctic, turned up in the Southeast California desert. You just never know. Another example in the southwestern deserts of isolated water bodies. This is the Colorado River flowing down through southern Nevada, western Arizona. And along the Colorado River, they have built a number of dams, of course, both for hydroelectric power but particularly to store water in reservoirs behind them. And some of these reservoirs are huge. This is Lake Powell in extreme southern Utah, straddling the Arizona border. So if you are, just a duck, well, fine, you're going to land there. But even if you're a seabird that got stuck out over the inland arid desert, this looks pretty good. This is a miniature ocean. So if you're a Jaeger or something flying over, so I went to Lake Powell and another lake just south of that, Lake Havasu. And here was swimming around our boat was a juvenile Sabin's gull. Normally a bird you would go out in the open ocean to see. Other examples, there are some natural lakes in the desert Southwest. This is Walker Lake in Arizona, or excuse me, in Nevada, really good for interesting water birds. And some water bodies in the arid West are unnatural. They're human built because they are cooling water deposit for power plants. This is a big power plant in northern Arizona, and they take the cooling water and just throw it out in this pond. And then it's great, for gulls, terns, shorebirds, and the like. Some of these isolated water bodies in the arid West are tiny. This is the whole thing. This is Quito Baquito, an organ pipe cactus national monument in southern Arizona. And this is turned up, I surf scoter on this pond. He was looking at the whole pond. The most famous bird here probably ever was a least grebe. Came up from Mexico, found this one little bit of water, and then stayed for like a year because he probably was scared to leave, after it found its one little Hail Mary puddle of water. Peninsulas. Peninsulas are like islands on three sides, but connected to the land on the fourth, but the same whole idea of sticking out in the ocean and acting as a lifeline to migrants stuck out over the water. A famous peninsula, this is sticking into Hudson Bay. Some of you may have been here. This is Churchill, Manitoba, and it's turned up all sorts of weird migrants, birds that end up out over the ice of Hudson Bay, or they keep coming north, and they get to the end of the peninsula and go, uh-oh, where do I go now? And so they stop and they just hang around Churchill for a few days, much to birders' delight. So why do you go to Churchill? Well, you used to go there to see Ross's gulls, which have become, unfortunately, much less reliable there in recent years. And the first time I ever went there, I was at the tip of the point right there by the grain elevators, and I looked up on the wire, and this bird was sitting there. It's a violet green swallow, which is normally from the western U.S., and here it was in Churchill. It was the second record for Manitoba at the time. So again, these peninsulas turn up all sorts of stuff. Another peninsula famous is the Seward Peninsula. It sticks west in mainland Alaska, where Nome is located. You go there, you go see things like gyrfalcons and other Arctic birds. This is a juvenile Aleutian tern, a specialty of that area, but it also turns up weird migrants, especially from Asia. An interesting subspecies of glaucous gull there called Barovianus. We won't go into subspecies of gulls. Coming down the Pacific coast, a really cool peninsula. This is Dungeness Spit, near Dungeness on the northeast corner of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And you can imagine some seabird that here out in the Strait of Juan de Fuca gets blown to the tip of the point, or some land bird is stuck out here. So we went out and there was a yellow-billed loon, a rare visitor from farther north, was swimming around Dungeness Spit. Or there was a storm and a bunch of red phalaropes, a normally open ocean bird, were knocked down and were swimming around pools at the Spit. One of the best birds ever there on the Spit, this was a lesser sand plover, a juvenile Asian bird that, again, just was attracted by being the first point of land that it got to coming in off the ocean. A really well-known peninsula farther south in California is Point Reyes, just an hour north of San Francisco. Lots of birders live in the Bay Area, so it's a very popular place. It's just grassland. And then you have these planted cypress trees around old historic ranch houses. And so again, if you're a bird that wants a tree or a paddock with some cows, you you immediately shoot for these places, so it concentrates the migrants, which otherwise are out over grass or more likely out over the Pacific Ocean nearby. So birders would come here to see eastern rarities. This is a rusty blackbird walking around one of those cattle paddocks, or one of the most, sorry, it's a horrible photo, but hey, it's 1980, what can you say? This is a skylark, the first record for the lower 48 states, and visited from Asia and spent the whole winter at Reyes, came back many years in a row. And then a few years later, another Asian bird we had there, a brambling, which have since turned up a few times in California. But again, the rarities or oddball stuff comes not only from Asia, if you're on the West Coast, they come from the East, or they come up from the South. And a bird that regularly comes up from the South to these migrant and vagrant hotspots is this bird called tropical kingbird, which is now, even in the last 10, 20 years, has occurred a fair number of times on the East Coast, all the way up through New York finally got a record, and New England's had records of these birds coming up from the tropics. They're probably misoriented migrants that should have gone south from Mexico to Central or Southern or South America for the winter, and they went 180 degrees the wrong direction. Instead of going south in fall, they went north in fall. So you can imagine, though, that they're probably in a dead end genetically, and they probably won't survive wherever they're heading. But these peninsulas in the West, again, fantastic for eastern vagrants, like, a Canada warbler and the like. Peninsulas on the Gulf of Mexico coast, there's several as well. This is Fort Morgan on the Alabama coast, a fantastic place for migrants. I was lucky, it was there once in the fall, and we had a black-throated gray warbler. So the same idea, if you're an Easterner, you're going to the South Shore of Long Island or something to look for a Western stray, like a birder in California is going to a peninsula to look for an Eastern stray. Also little peninsulas. This was on the Louisiana coast, believe it or not, a red-faced warbler, an incredible rarity for Louisiana. The one time we got lucky and got one there. Or this is a shiny cowbird, a bird that came up probably from Florida, the Caribbean, here on the coast of upper coast of Florida. In fact, this picture, it doesn't have to be necessarily a public park. This is a birder lives in this house in Pensacola. And so their yard is the tip of a peninsula in Pensacola, right on the Gulf Coast. And their yard list is approaching 300 species, given their geographic location. The champion of peninsulas is the is the Great Lakes. There is peninsula after peninsula after peninsula. Right down here, Point Pelee, sticking into Lake Erie, southernmost point of Canada. Tawas Point, Michigan. Whitefish Point, Michigan. The Keweenaw Peninsula. Anyway, there's points all over the place, and Great Lakes area birders, of course, take advantage of that. Massive numbers of migrants. This is Point Pelee. This is the tip of Point Pelee. This is the southernmost point of Canada, and birders will sit up here first thing in the morning to see what birds in spring are coming in off of Lake Erie. The Great Lakes are so huge, they might as well be an ocean for a poor migrant land bird caught out over them during first thing in the morning after they've been flying all night. So the same idea with the ocean goes on with the Great Lakes and being on peninsulas. So you go there and you just see incredible numbers of regular migrants, scarlet tanagers, or the same in the fall, Cape May warblers in the fall. This is Whitefish Point on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, same idea. This is Tawas Point, sticking south into Lake Huron, also in Michigan. It's turned up great numbers of migrants and rarities. This is Presque Isle Point in northwest Pennsylvania near Presque Isle, PA, sticking into the eastern end of Lake Erie. It's also turned up all sorts of cool birds here on these. I went here once and had a Franklin's gull and a laughing gull standing side by side, just about, both rare for there. Okay, I did live there 14 years. My one picture, Cape May, famous point sticking into the Atlantic. And again, the idea is that birds get maybe blown by a northwest wind overnight. They drift out to sea as they're migrating at night. At dawn, they're stuck a mile, 5, 10 miles offshore. They beat their way back in, or maybe a foggy morning and they get disoriented in the fog and they end up out over the ocean. They beat their way back in and then concentrate in certain patches of greenery around the Cape May Peninsula. Same exact idea, South Shore, Long Island, or even right on the immediate coast some days in Westchester. Birds coming in off the Long Island Sound, maybe it's some patch of trees along the coast in Rye or something like that. Maybe at the tip of Croton Point sticking out into the Hudson. It acts as a mini peninsula tip, not as isolated as some of these, but better than just an average spot. And Croton has turned up, some great birds and some really good concentrations at the right time of year when the conditions are right. Moving up the coast, another famous peninsula, it's really good for migrants, is Plum Island, Newburyport in Massachusetts. And the easternmost peninsula in North America is at St. John's, Newfoundland, Cape Race. There's the end of the point. That's the easternmost point of North America. And so both oddball Western birds that are going east, they hit the end of the line. And this area, St. John's, has turned up incredible number of records of Western strays, hermit warblers and stuff. They're just amazing because these things are so misoriented, they end up on the easternmost point of North America. But as you imagine, it's also the best place to look, probably, if the weather's right, like a storm with east winds, of bringing European birds from Europe, from Iceland, or Southeast Greenland across the North Atlantic here, first place they can find and land and rest is eastern, these tips of peninsulas in eastern Newfoundland. So here you are in St. John's Harbor, and a bird that turns up almost every year, every other year is this. This is used to be called bugle, now common gull. It's the European equivalent of our ringbill gull, and they get European oyster catchers and red shanks and lapwings and all these crazy European birds you get one of in your lifetime, maybe in New York or two. They get every 2 or 3 springs there at the eastern tip of Newfoundland. The northern tip of Newfoundland also acts as a weird congregation point. This is Lanso Meadows, the Viking historic site in the north tip of Newfoundland, and it's turned up bizarre birds because it's the end of the line for birds heading that direction, whether they wanted to or not. Okay, sewage treatment ponds. How can we have a talk without mentioning sewage treatment ponds? Typical, they look like this with a muddy edge. Unfortunately, they've improved, quote unquote, a lot of the sewage treatment ponds, and they no longer are good anymore, or they have totally closed them off to access. There used to be far more of them in the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. There are now far fewer that birders can actually visit or that even exist that are good, unfortunately. But they're really good for certain types of birds. And you can really tell that's a sewage treatment pond. I won't go into the details, but by both the color and the floating objects. But certain shorebirds love sewage treatment pond. This is a juvenile Baird sandpiper. If you find sewage treatment pond, your chance for a Baird's is better than a lot of places. This is a juvenile ruff. Ruffs love sewage treatment ponds. This is a sharp-tailed sandpiper in the west. They love sewage treatment ponds. Curlew sandpiper, they love sewage treatment ponds. I gotta admit, I lied. This photo was taken at Jamaica Bay, right down the road from you guys. It wasn't a sewage pond, but curlew sandpipers love sewage treatment ponds. There's a semi-palmated sandpiper. And Bonaparte's gulls love sewage treatment ponds. And mixed in with Bonaparte's, you get a couple rare visitors, black-headed gull and this bird, which is a young little gull. Their numbers have dropped off quite a bit from what they used to be in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but you can still get them occasionally. And again, sewage treatment ponds are just great for these rare gulls that are related to Bonaparte's. Sometimes even something rarer turns up at a sewage treatment pond. This is a sewage treatment pond near Santa Barbara. And back in the 90s, this bird, a bical teal, the first record of a live one found ever in California, turned up at a sewage treatment plant. Dumps, aka landfills, a wonderful little micro habitat type that concentrates gulls. So you go there. This is a dump in California these are all California gulls, but turned up there one year was, in the old days, this was an Iceland gull, one of the first records ever for California of an Iceland gull, now lumped with Thayer's gull, so not so rare anymore. Glaucous gull, your chances of seeing glaucous gull are no better than at a dump. You can, used to be a great dump at Croton Point. Of course, they closed that long ago. There used to be a great dump, Fresh Kills at Staten Island. That's now no more. There's still a great dump outside Philadelphia near Trenton, which turns up 10,000 gulls, a day if you look. And you'll always, any day you go there, you could see an Iceland gull or glaucous gull. They're regular there in small numbers. Out west, you also look at dumps for rare Asian or West Coast gulls. This is a young slatyback gull at a California dump, a bird normally you only see in Alaska. Not all rarities or interesting birds at dumps are gulls. This is a famous former dump bird. This is what used to be called Mexican crow, now called Tamaulipas crow. And the only place you used to be able to see it in the US was at the Brownsville, Texas dump, where there'd be a flock of them. And that was the only place to see them in the US. And we got a kick out of it because the city of Brownsville then declared the Brownsville dump to be the Brownsville Mexican Crow Sanctuary. That was the official title. Anyway, waterfalls, same idea. This is Niagara Falls, can concentrate gulls. And you go to Niagara and that area, this is a herring gull, but this is a Thayer's type gull, which used to be its own species, now lumped with Iceland gull. And if you were a New York state lister and wanted to see Thayer's gull for New York, there would have been no better place to get it for New York than to stand on the New York side of Niagara Falls and see Thayer's gull. Migration corridors. What else can act as a funneling birds? Rivers, major rivers act as funneling. And so you can see some pretty cool concentrations of birds along rivers. This is the upper Mississippi River in late winter in Minnesota. But here's a closer to home example. This is the Susquehanna River flowing through eastern Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania birders under certain weather conditions, like in spring, will go here like fog or a rainstorm in like early mid-May. And they'll find things like flocks of scoters and brant that are migrating overland in spring. They leave the Long Island Sound Atlantic and head inland, and then they're knocked low down by the bad weather and they're flying up the river as a migration corridor. So it's kind of cool how these rivers can act as a concentration point for migrants and even vagrant or rarities, shall we say, like birds you would think of as being ocean birds. Same thing out west. This is the Columbia River and the Columbia River Gorge on the border between Oregon and Washington. And the same thing, scoters, loons, brant, rare gulls are found up and down the river here and looked for by birders on both sides. Ridges act as migration corridors for land bird migrants, but particularly for raptors. And the Appalachian Mountains are a wonderful natural corridor for raptor migration. This is the Appalachians in extreme western Maryland, but a really well-known spot in the Appalachians for raptor migration in fall is, and some of you have already figured out where this old photo I took was, it's Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania. And I have a great story, quick story to tell about Scarsdale Audubon. I was here in one of my early years. This may have been the day I got my lifer golden eagle with John Moyle standing next to me. It was on a Scarsdale Audubon field trip in mid-October. And here we are, you're looking up the ridge, you're looking northeast here. You're all sitting here looking up, and the raptors are coming straight toward you down the ridge at Hawk Mountain. And what you do is you number these little bumps. That's bump 1 or hill 1, I forgot exactly the term. That's 2, maybe that's 3 and that's 4. And you'd call out and you'd say, goshawk over number 2. And so everybody would sort of look that way and the birds would come toward you. And there was a guy in a Bronx Bird Club meeting. I don't know if anybody know, Tom Burke may roll his eyes. His name was Cy Stepanoff. And he was leading the Bronx Club, and I was sitting right next with John Moyle and the Scarsdale Audubon group. And Cy Stepanoff was calling out, Cooper's hawk over number 2, sharp-shinned hawk over number 1. And I'm looking at John and saying, how can he do that? I was still a young kid. I was 14 years old, 13 at the time. How could he do that? And John says, I don't. And so John Moyle and I quietly walked up to this guy when he wasn't with his group. And we asked him, how could you tell that was a Cooper's hawk that distance away? And he looked at me as the young kid and said, Psh, don't tell anybody, but you're only as good as the group lets you be. So at that point, I knew I wanted to be a bird tour leader for the rest of my life, after hearing that. So it was one of those memorable moments of my Scarsdale Audubon career. Feeders. Talking about great migrant and vagrant traps is feeders. And how many of you, well, I can't see your hands, but I bet you a lot of you, if you're interested in looking for rare birds, have gone to somebody's feeder at some point, a seed feeder, a hummingbird feeder, a varied thrush, a western tanager, a black-headed grosbeak. Who knows what turns up at, especially, a wintertime feeder. This is a feeder in the West, but this is a Harris's sparrow. Very rare in the West, just like it would be if it was a feeder in the East, because they're only regular in the central part of North America. But I also sort of pose this question to people. A lot of people feed birds, only a small percent of which know what the heck birds are coming to their feeders. A lot of them don't even know what they're seeing. They don't care. They just enjoy, maybe they know the Cardinals and the Blue Jays. But, so if somebody who wasn't a birder had this bird at their feeder all winter long, they'd probably just pass it off as yet another male house sparrow, with the black face. But it's not, it's a Harris sparrow. And so you wonder how many rare birds turned up at feeders that never, ever, birders never hear about. Either the owner didn't know what it was, didn't care, or didn't want 500 people traipsing into their kitchen, of course, over the course of the winter to see it. So they didn't tell anybody. But, just, you never know. This is a feeder in Santa Barbara, or when I lived there in the 80s. The black-headed grosbeak belonged there, but this was actually late winter, and this grosbeak had wintered there, so rare in the winter. Normally they go to Mexico for the winter, but at the same feeder was a male rose-breasted grosbeak. So sort of, east meets west at the same, bowl of sunflower seeds. So really cool. Hummingbird feeders. Now, hummingbird feeding has exploded over the last few decades. And people also keep their feeders up later in the season than they used to. And those of you in the East now realize that Western hummingbirds turn up almost annually at feeders somewhere in the region every year, usually, sort of October, November, December, until it gets just too darn cold, and then the birds may or may not survive. I was in Texas once when this bird showed up. We didn't even know what it was when it came. This is a immature green-breasted mango. It was the first record for Texas in the US at the time. There've now been a number of them. Another hummingbird, this is the first record for the US, it was in California, of a Xanthus hummingbird, a bird normally restricted to the southern tip of Baja in Mexico. But again, hummingbirds, if you get an out-of-season hummingbird, sure, you can get a ruby throat that lingers late at a feeder, but often, by the time November rolls around, you're as likely to have a rufous hummingbird at your feeder in Westchester as you are a late ruby-throated. So again, feeders are this incredible magnet for not only concentrating birds, but for oddball stuff as well. And we're getting right near the end. I'll finish sort of by saying sometimes a migrant or vagrant trap isn't much of anything at all. This is a patch of introduced Myoporum in San Diego next to a dumpster, that's Interstate 8 with cars whizzing by. Somebody happened to live in the apartment complex here, took their garbage out to the dumpster, looked into the Myoporum bush and went, "What is that?" Anyway, that's a mangrove yellow warbler. It's a subspecies of yellow warbler from the mangroves of Central America with a full chestnut head. And the only record for California, one of two. And so it just goes to show, stuff turns up anywhere. People ask, by the way, they regularly have asked me, Paul, what percent of rare birds, these vagrants, do you think birders find? 50%? 75? Because we know where to go. We know to go to marshlands. We know to go to Central Park. We know to go to Jones Beach. We know to go to Montauk. I look at these are beginning birders, and I go, you're not even close. My estimate of what percent of the rarities get found by all those birders out there, my guess is 2 or 3%. Even when you know where to go and what time of year, you're just scratching the surface of what's out there. Even, a lot of times people go far flung, they go hours away thinking they need to go that far away to find something. Granted, if you go to Montauk, your chances are better than if you stay, let's say, home in Scarsdale of finding a rarity. But I'll guarantee you, just in your local patches, a place like Croton Point, a place like a park right along the Long Island Sound, a patch of nice trees that have, let's say, berries on them late into the winter, surrounded by nothing. You don't need a famous island or peninsula tip offshore to have a really cool birding experience with lots of migrants or a rarity or two. So again, we've done our little trip all around North America. The big fault I told you about has shifted 90 degrees and now runs here. But here you are in Westchester County. I'm out here in San Diego. But between me and you, we're drowning in wonderful migrant and vagrant traps, some well covered and some waiting to be discovered and horribly underbirded. So thanks a lot, and I'll entertain any questions.
Also, a comment for everybody to know, one of the trips that Paul and John Moyle and I went to, we went up to Ithaca, to Sapsecker Woods. I don't know if you remember this one, Paul, or not.
Yeah.
We were at Taconic Falls State Park, and I saw this great big blackbird that looked like it had a piece of red cloth in its beak and went above its head and sort of above the falls. We were walking down the trail, and John and Paul walked farther down because they heard it call, and the call it was making, they thought it was either a kingfisher or a flicker, and ended up being a pileated, and I saw it as it landed on the tree, and it was the first pileated I had ever seen. Do you remember that, Paul?
Yeah, I remember. It was a good look. Of course, they used to be up there. Well, they're always have been up there, but they've actually increased since those days. They were less common. Pileatids have actually increased and moved into more residential areas in some areas than they used to be. By the way, I still think, as I said, there's things to be learned in, I think, Westchester County. One of the great things, when I left now decades ago, there were a couple birders that birded Croton Point regularly, and that was it. One was Berna Weissman then became Berna Lincoln, if anybody knew her. Bill Howe, who long since moved to New Mexico. And they once on a hurricane had a yellow-nosed albatross fly by Croton Point, much to the chagrin of the rest of us who were birding elsewhere. But then, and then Tom Burke and Gail started birding the heck out of rye, and they turned up all these incredible birds on the Long Island shore. And then I felt left out, but I'd already left New York permanent, on a regular basis. But I remember birding a place in Larchmont called Flint Park, and they had a leaf dump. And any of you know the idea of leaf dump? They just threw all the the leaves and garden stuff in the fall, and there was all this grassy, weedy stuff growing. And even before I left, I birded there regularly in the fall. This would have been the mid-70s, and I saw multiple blue grosbeaks there in the fall. I saw a loggerhead shrike there in the fall, right before they totally vanished just about from the Northeast. Now, of course, there's been one at Croton Point for a couple times the last couple of years. But even, but it used to be, we live in Westchester, but if you really want to see good birds, you got to go to Long Island. You got to go to Central Park. Well, you don't. There's some really cool spots, mostly on the shore, but even I'm sure there's some places in the middle of the county as well. Maybe a big reservoir, under just the right weather conditions would have some really neat water birds grounded on the reservoir. So again, it's just close to home. I really got a kick when I visited last June. It's something I like doing is I call it sea watching on the Long Island Sound. I did it with Doug one morning. I set up at Manor Park in Larchmont and at dawn and just scoped or scanned. I only have my binoculars on the trip. Long Island Sound to see what's moving up and down the sound first thing in the morning. And we had 2 royal terns fly by, really rare bird for the sound. So again, it's just this idea of keying in on a certain habitat type, certain time of year, certain time of day, definitely certain weather conditions on producing some really, concentrations of migrants and rarities, either just local rarities or even regional statewide rarities.
I remember there was some young kid in Larchmont, went out somewhere in a little swampy area and found a field fair. Can you believe that?
Yeah, that was my first really rare bird I found for my life. The first really rare bird was on a Scarsdale Audubon field trip to Jones Beach in late October, and at the Coast Guard facility, I walked into the median divide of the Coast Highway there in front of and found a sage thrasher on the field. That was my first really rare bird. But the next one was in Larchmont, and it was down to Premium Marsh area, and that was a field fair, a European thrush. It was it was at that point the 4th record for North America, first for New York. And yeah, it got me going. At that point I was 17, and it was great because I also met a lot of other New York birders through that who lived outside Westchester, like a famous guy named Tom Davis, another one named Paul Buckley, and others, and who then expanded my horizons further in the New York area.
I was up chasing that field fair with Tom Davis the next day.
Did you see it?
Nope. It apparently was just that one day wonder.
No, it was there several days.
No, it was there the next morning.
Well, I guess we came a little too late.
Yeah, I was there for like 4 or 5 days, but then after the first day or two, it was only seen at dawn, leaving a roost site.
Yeah, and heading somewhere east.
Yeah, and then, but the year or two, a few years before that, there was a fellow who was a bird photographer who lived right there named Sid Bart, who even did a book on bird photography in the same exact area, Premium Marsh there in Larchmont near a shell border. He found an ash-throated flycatcher, which at that time, I believe, was the first state record for New York, 1971 or something like that. Now they're almost annual, one a fall and late fall. But it just showed, this little tiny pocket marsh, and on the Larchmont near a shell border, has turned up these 2 incredibly rare birds, and it's hardly covered. I mean, it's only visited, sporadically. It doesn't get regular coverage.
Yeah. I also knew Cy Stepanov and his
Did
wife.
you? Yeah.
They were, by the way, they were folk dancers. She used to teach folk dancing.
Oh, good. Yeah, they were Bronx.
Yeah.
So,
Paul, I have a
Paul, this is-
question. I have a question. Do you think that climate change is also adding to the vagrants? Just from the perspective that, you know, weather patterns have changed dramatically, winds have changed, you know.
Yeah, there are all sorts of theories on, you know, vagrancy seems up, but you could explain vagrancy, you know, the rate of which rare birds turn up, simply by the fact there are more birders out in the field, and more important, they know when and where to look for vagrants. I'll just give you a very quick example. When I moved to Cape May from Santa Barbara in 1994, and at that point only was it beginning to be known that late fall, end of October, November was the time to look for a lot of western strays on the East Coast. And if you got a big storm that came up from the west with southwest winds that hit in late October and early mid-November, you could get all these vagrants. And just a few years later, I think it was 97, one storm brought to Cape May 5 cave swallows, 2 ash-throated flycatchers, a western tanager, an ash-throated flycatcher, a McGillivray's warbler, and the first New Jersey and 3rd or 4th North American record of brown-chested martin, a bird from South America. And I remember Tom Burke came up or down and saw all those things. And that lit a light bulb, I think, in a lot of people, either that single event or events like it, where, oh my God, late October, November, a lot of, you know, birders much before that, they were always out in September to see the warblers, October to see the hawks. November was sort of that in-between time. What do we do in November? Okay, maybe goshawks, waterfowl, you know, in November, you know, Christmas council starts soon. Now birders know in the Northeast that early mid-November is like the best time of year under certain weather to be out for these vagrants. And that wasn't known, I don't think, widespread till the early mid-90s or late 90s. So that could be a factor, the birders knowing that. Another factor could be toxins in the environment. They wonder if increased toxins that it's messing up the birds' inner navigation on some of them. But last but not least would be climate change. If there are yet stronger storms, that's more likely to displace birds, obviously, if the winds are stronger. One thing, though, is if, for example, the winters are generally milder, let's say this last winter, did you guys get any snow?
No.
I heard there was
No.
like snow in Central Park for the whole year, maybe what, 0.1
I think
inch?
we got about 1/3 of an inch.
So birds when I grew up in Larchmont, it would go below 0 every winter, once or twice, a big cold snap. That would just wipe out, any half-hardy bird trying to spend the winter would just, and by the Christmas count, there was often be snow on the ground. Now on the Christmas count in late December, it's barely gone, below freezing a few times, and it's still in the 40s every day. And so these rare birds like an ash-throated flycatcher or a western tanager coming to a feeder or a rufous hummingbird coming to a feeder is still alive, in late December. And so birders have that much longer period of time to find them because they're not getting wiped out by severe weather, cold that is, but it's not getting cold maybe till January, if it does at all. So these are all possible factors, some natural, some human, and some just a factor of more birders out at the right time of year looking.
But on
And
the
better
other,
communication now.
Well, now you
internet,
guys have
people-
the problem with all the water you just got. I mean, that's going to be amazing. When
Oh, well, that's going to change distribution of birds, of course. As
unbelievable what that's going to do. And that when the snow melt starts, and it's already starting. That's
Right.
what my sister's telling me in the north.
Right.
You're in Santa Barbara, so But the
Right.
point being that the Sierra Nevadas are going to just start
But, oh yeah,
creating mudslides, and I mean it's going to be It's going to
Yeah.
be interesting to know what happens over there.
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah. In the east, though, you know, a couple examples are if a warming climate, that the sort of alpine or subalpine little zones on the tops of the tallest mountains in New England are going to disappear because the habitat's going to shift upslope with the warming climate. So birds that are only restricted at the top, like Bicknell's thrush, may get forced out, you know, of the southern part of its range because its habitat will change. Also, the Swainson's thrushes are moving upslope and swamping out the Bicknell's thrushes. So that we're getting off topic a bit, but yeah, it can be quite alarming, even in our lifetimes, what might happen with some specific habitat types.
But on the other side, the cold can really be good too. For example, the reservoir in Central Park, this is the first time in many, many years that I've ever seen it without ice. And when you get ice on the reservoir, you get a lot of rare birds standing on the ice. I think, was it last year or the year before, or we had 8 or 9 species of gulls in one day, including slatyback, black-headed, lesser blackback, Iceland glaucus. It was amazing. And you don't get that. You don't see those birds if there's no ice.
Yeah, that'll. There's a great example of a local habitat island and a certain habitat type ice turning up rarities, and if there's no ice, what effect that's going to have.
So I just want to say, Paul, thank you so much. I learned a lot. You know, I mostly do local birding, and you inspired me more so that I can, you know, find these little islands, these little peninsulas, these little rare places. And when I travel, I've been to a couple of those places that you mentioned in a few travels out west and so forth. And if I ever get to travel again, I'm going to know what to look for, that little island of trees in the middle of a desert or whatever. So thank
Or
you
like,
so much.
yeah. And
Absolutely.
again, in addition to the habitat type, and again, living in Westchester, for example, local, it's also knowing the time of year, knowing again, late October, November is great for oddball stuff to turn up, or even late spring. I mean, don't give up in late May when the last of the major pushes of warblers are through. Sometimes the very end of May, you know, turns up, you know, somebody spots a Manx shearwater or a frigate bird or something flying over the, you know, up the Hudson River or in the Long Island Sound, or, you know, so sometimes it's those tail ends, the front or back ends of the migration periods, even though the volume has declined, get some of the oddball stuff, if that's what you're in, you know, and so don't ignore those periods as well. And that's what a lot of people have figured out. And again, under certain weather conditions, your chances are better than under just going out randomly. And so talk amongst yourselves about what those weather conditions are: a warm front, a cold front, a rainstorm, a fog bank, you know, things like that might help or hinder your success rate.
Are the questions in the chat? Aaron, are you there? I don't know if Aaron is there. I can't get the chat. Does anybody have a question in the chat that he hasn't answered? I can't get.
Yeah, there are some questions. There were some questions in the chat. I'm scrolling back. Hang on.
Leslie, maybe you can help. I can't get the seam to scroll.
Yeah, sure. Okay, here is one question from Bernie. Can any of the vagrant birds actually nest in these out-of-the-way places?
No, I thought that was a good one.
Yeah, good question. The answer is rare, but yes, in fact, vagrancy is one way of population expansion. So you get these satellite areas. If a flock goes somewhere and then just stays there and starts breeding, they can start a new population, and if it gets large enough, become fairly stable. The problem is, for a lot of these birds, they're just single birds, and of course it's hard to start a population with only one of you. Or if you're an insectivore and you go north and fall instead of south, that's probably an ecological dead end for you. You know, your days are numbered. However, sometimes a bird will come to an area way out of its range and successfully, let's say, winter there, It could be a warbler that winters in San Diego because our winters are so mild. We get an eastern warbler or an Arizona warbler and it spends the winter and it successfully does so. And then it comes back 10 years running. We've had a Grace's warbler locally for 10 years straight, or an Hepatic tanager for 12 years. You know, that's as long as those birds ever live. Well, they don't know they're out of range, but it's successful. In New York, there's examples of not so much land birds who do that, but water birds who come back year after year because they successfully do it. A spotted redshank came back 2-3 years in a row to Brooklyn because it was able to overwinter there on the shore, as one example. But yes, the answer is yes, they can actually form new parts of the range of the bird, but it's fairly rare just because you need a bunch of them to successfully do it and survive, not just a single individual.
I wonder if it's only weather that gets the birds so disoriented during migration.
No, it's both weather and faulty, lack of a better way, faulty GPS unit inside their brain. They're just, a lot of these birds are hardwired. They're not, a goose is going to follow mama and dada goose, as a family group and learn the migration route. But a warbler, which migrates at night, or a flycatcher, or grosbeak, a tanager, a thrush, it's hardwired and it is told where to go, both direction and an approximate distance. And hopefully it's correct. And the wood thrush ends up in Panama for the winter. But instead, if it's off 90 degrees, it may end up in California. And unfortunately, if it keeps going, it ends up in the Pacific Ocean to a watery grave. So there's this hard wiring faulty mechanism in a certain percent of young birds. That's why there are more rarities in the fall, and a large percent of them are immatures doing their first fall migration because they are hardwired the wrong way, and their survival rate is not good. Birders are thrilled and we all go goo goo gaga, but for the bird itself, it's probably not a great thing. There are exceptions, but that's the other major source. So big weather events and hard wiring problems.
So I think it's interesting when there's a bird. I think my sister had a vermilion flycatcher where she in Orlando wetlands, and it was there like several winters, and then it wasn't there anymore. And you think it's the exact same bird, right?
Correct. So that's clearly an example. The bird did it right. You can winter if you're a flycatcher in Orlando. It doesn't get too cold. You do it again, you're back in the exact same field. It's the same plumage bird, I assume. And it does that year after year. That is absolutely the same bird. And then all of a sudden it stops showing up. Guess what? It died of old age, or got picked off by a Cooper's hawk, or who knows what happened. But it would have done that till the day it died, and it did it 5 years. Well, that's actually an average lifespan for a vermilion flycatcher, is probably 5 years, once it, yeah.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed the presentation, but I go birding with Doug a lot. And so he's talked about you. And I'm actually reading Ken Kaufman's book, Kingbird Highway, about his big year in 1973. And so he mentioned you seeing the field fair when you did it in like New York or in New Jersey or wherever. And I was like, oh my God, that's Paul. Paul
Yeah, well, the field fair was
talked about it.
on the Larchmont, New Rochelle border at Premium Marsh. So it was really local. Yeah, and that was, back then, even birders came all the way from as far as Chicago to see it. But again, it was only there, it was there a few days, 4 days, 5, something like that. But again, after the first day or two, only seen right at dawn. And then we couldn't figure out where it went the rest of the day.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think it's 8:30. And if we don't have any more questions, Paul, thank you so much. It was wonderful and inspiring and give us a lot of hope. And also great hints about where to look. And
and it was great. Thanks for inviting me and at least coming back virtually. I did live or visit my folks in Larchmont for easily, it was probably 30 years before they moved away and I stopped having that family connection, but then I'd still come and visit old friends and
Yeah,
bird there. So it was my early years, with Scarsdale Audubon and John Moyle and then others.
Right.
It was, lots of fond memories.
well, I'm glad about that. And thanks everybody else for joining in. And have a happy spring migration, and I hope some vagrants and some unusual ones will show up for us. And then go on their way to have a successful rest of their migration.
That's right.
Okay, I'm going to be signing off. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
All right.
Thank you.
Come
Thank
on
you.
out and see the model duck.
Yeah,
The model duck, all right.
duck, that's it.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Paul. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter.
Bye.
Thank you for the talk and for answering my question, Paul. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Night, okay. Okay, over and out.